The Frank Beckmann Show, News Talk 760 WJR.
All right, welcome back into the program, everybody. Nice to have you with us. The spot where we always keep the best informed audience in all of radio, the Frank Beckmann Show. We continue on the Frank Beckmann Show now with a man who's been with us many times before. With these protests continuing, even today, it's a perfect time to bring in the man who's advised us on so many issues in the past involving the military. He's a senior fellow, military expert at Defense Priorities, and he's retired from the U.S. Army. His name, Danny Davis, and we're happy to have him back on the Frank Beckmann Show this morning. Danny, how you been, my friend?
I'm doing really well. It's delightful to be back, Frank.
Well, it's good to have you here, and I'm just glad to hear that you've avoided any of the problems with COVID and the like. And now we see these protests going on all over. And yesterday we heard the president talking about how he might institute the Insurrection Act and activate the National Guard, and that's caused a big to-do around the country. Is that the way to go?
You know, right now, Frank, it's not. There could come a day when if things get completely out of control, just like you were talking about a second ago, if the protest there in your place gets out of control, it's necessary, not only okay, but necessary to keep the peace for all of the citizens of the whole country and the whole area. But that needs to be, like the use of force is supposed to be overseas, the last resort. But when you start talking about using muscular military response like first, then I think you're setting this up for some real problems.
Well, exactly. And, the president created quite the controversy by threatening to bring in the National Guard. Let's explain to everybody who the Guardsmen really are, because we're talking about soldiers, right? Right, yeah. And there's also, it's important to make a distinction here because there's two separate categories that people are talking about, both the president and others. Is you have the National Guard troops, and then you also have a lot of it growing calls for active duty military troops. And that's where I want to make a distinction, that there is a problem with that because the National Guard troops are expressly trained in crowd control, de-escalation techniques, etc., and how to solve problems, not to escalate them and to keep everyone safe. The active duty military troops are trained to kill enemy soldiers. That's our primary task. We're not trained in de-escalation, and that's why it could be putting fuel on fire. Instead of putting something out, it could make it worse if you use that. Well, and it also, the other thing that strikes me, Danny, is we have something called, in our country that's brought up from time to time, called posse comitatus, which means that our military, or explains how our military is not allowed to operate at home unless we're under direct attack by some foreign enemy that's threatening the country, right? Right. The only exception to that is this frequently mentioned here recently, the 1807 Insurrection Act, which under some circumstances could be used if literally, like the state of Michigan was about to be overrun by some organized internal suppression, which, of course, we're not anywhere near that. So that should be extremely unlikely, but again, only in the last resort. Otherwise, we need to train federal, state, local law enforcement, National Guard at the command of the governor to keep the peace. And only if all of that fails, then you can think about the higher ones, but you definitely don't want to start with that. Yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying. So, in other words, it was an overreaction by the president, but he's frustrated too. I'm convinced that this is a man who wants to help and wants to put an end to all of this rioting that we're seeing in so many cities right now, and he just may have gone a little too far with this suggestion. Well, I think that he is, because he's thinking, let's bring order back immediately. So his mentality is to go to, well, I know like the 82nd Airborne, the 101st Airborne, those are elite guys, so let's send them in there. I mean, that's his thought. But, you've seen even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you saw former Secretary of Defense Mattis, trying to put a little bit of temper on that because that's just not the way. That's just not the way it works. And yeah, he got a little ahead of the skis, as they say. Yeah, a little bit out in front of them and over the tips. But you know what? First, we've got to rely on our local law enforcement to handle these situations. And for the most part, they've been doing a terrific job in keeping the protesters under control. Sure, there have been the night in Minneapolis with the burnings of the police precinct and all of that the
city basically allowed, the mayor allowed. But that's the exception and not the rule. And most of the protests in the country, thankfully, have been much less violent than that. And that's
well,
the
yeah,
best
and
way.
I think that I was going to make that same point because, I mean, even in my own neighborhood yesterday, there was hundreds of people gathered together, and it was a beautiful sight. I mean, it was black people, white people together, and they were all saying, hey, we need racial harmony. We need justice for everybody. We need security for everybody. Everybody deserves to be safe and to not be subjected to whoever these rioters and looters are that are just looking to cause problems. But we can't let that, blind the fact that there are some legitimate concerns that some people have had, that some of these protesters that are angry have a valid point. We can't, gloss over that because of the actions of some nuts that are causing problems for everybody. They need to be dealt with, but so do we need to deal with the justice issue.
Yeah, and I just want everybody to understand also, as the stories keep coming out about Mr. Floyd's death at the hands of this Officer Chauvin, that there was no evidence in the official autopsy that showed that Chauvin choked him to death with his knee, but the second autopsy by Floyd's family did sort of suggest that. But Floyd also was full of all kinds of drugs, and he had fentanyl in his system, and that's a problem too. So there were some other circumstances that affected what happened. Not that that's an excuse for what the officer did, kneeling on his neck for 10 minutes like that, but everybody's got responsibility for their behavior in our society. And if you bring the police out by your actions, they're going to protect themselves in what they view as their only way. I'm not trying to make excuses for the Chauvin or the other officers who didn't report him, but that is what's going to happen. So it was an unfortunate case. I don't think that is the story of every white police officer in this country. I refuse to believe that, Danny Davis.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, I've seen firsthand. I know some police officers, and the vast majority are great, but we can't let these exceptions go. I mean, they have to be addressed.
Absolutely. And, hey, Danny, thank you so much for the time. Always appreciate it, my friend. We'll talk again soon, okay?
All right, thanks, Frank. Talk to you soon.
Danny Davis, the retired U.S. Army servant for our country, senior fellow military expert at Defense Priorities, and he was a servant for our country. That's how he views his service, as if he was serving you.